Hey everybody, Jamie here from the Flow Genome Project to talk about flow states and how to get into them. So just a little bit of backstory as folks are jumping on. We came up with a lot of the ideas around hacking flow and how to spend more time in it, enjoying our lives, when we have been researching and writing our most recent book called Stealing Fire. And that doesn't come out till February with HarperCollins. But until then, we wanted to kind of share some of these ideas because when we've been in workshops and events training folks, one of the main questions that always comes up is, okay, here's the neuroscience, okay, here's the biohacking, here's all the cool things I can do, there's action sports, there's meditation, there's psychedelics, there's dancing, there's music, there's all these phenomenal things that we love, but what's the best way to get into flow? And pretty much every time we give a talk, every time we have an event, someone's going to sidle up to us and ask that very question, what's the best way? And to which we would respond, it depends. It depends on a bunch of factors in your life, and we're going to actually go through them. So rather than kind of leaving it at the wishy-washy, we're going to actually try and nail that. It depends right on down to the ground. But what we'd like to do is be able to say it depends on a set of clear and consistent criteria, and you can use these tools to help you figure it out. So in a nutshell, the best way to get into flow is the one that fits your risk tolerance. Right? Are you willing to risk your life or your mind? If you are, that's a whole different category. If you're not, that rules some things right out of the equation. The next is reward. So it could be, for instance, if you're a single parent holding down 2 or 3 jobs for to provide for some small kids, you might not have the luxury of someone who's just sold their business and is a freewheeling bachelor traveling the world. So reward, how much return on your investment of time and money and everything else, is also going to matter. And then fundamentally, time. How much time do you have to invest in it? And also, how long does it take to pay off? So fundamentally, we would say that the way to choose what's the best way for you to get into a flow state on any given day is to say the value of it equals the reward times the time divided by the risk. So let's take a few of those, you sort of break down some boundary cases or kind of extreme examples that give us an idea. So one of the sort of slowest and steadiest might be something like volunteering in a soup kitchen or engaging in traditional prayer, right? So you could do those on a daily basis, on a weekly basis, and you could do them for years, even decades. And you might find some benefit, and there's clearly lots of research on helper's high and the good things that happen when people do reach out and display service and empathy, or even prayer. The idea of reflecting on the sacred and your conception of it can also be really good. Now, whether or not you get that lightning bolt aha, another question and a subsequent question. So what we would propose there is the time it takes is really quite long, right? Both to get the sort of long-term person-changing kind of payoffs, as well as how long does it take, for instance, to learn and become really adept and proficient in meditation. You might get an initial early taste, but it could take, again, decades to master. Now, so the time is really long. The reward is good, but not necessarily like hair on fire, earth-changing, and the risk is extremely low. So for someone who has all the time in the world, that could be a great way to go. That's the kind of slow and steady wins the race. For someone who has other sense of urgency or goals, right, you could take the other far extreme. So, and just so everybody understands what we're talking about here, we're talking about altered states of consciousness, specifically flow states, those that leave you with a sense of selflessness. So I've no longer got that little voice going on inside my head. A sense of immersion into a deep present moment, so I'm not kicked out into pasts or futures. And then also a sense of kind of ease or effortlessness. And finally, richness, the sense of, holy smokes, I am seeing things, thinking about things, and having access to information and connections that I don't normally. So the classic kind of moments of inspiration, moments of sort of eureka moments, all those kinds of things would show up in these altered states we're talking about. And for those of you that are just joining now, what we're talking about is fundamentally what we call the ecstasis equation, which is really how do we spend more time selectively and skillfully getting out of our waking daily selves. Because as many of us know, and in fact 1 in 4 of us are currently on psychiatric medicines. Suicides for everyone from ages 12 to 78 are on the rise. And more of us die from painkiller overdoses in the last 6 to 7 years than the next leading cause of fatality in auto accidents combined. So you could take a step and you could say, hey, our waking state, regular, worried, well sense of ourselves, isn't hacking it. Our sort of pop psychology, which focuses on disease, focuses on medical or medicated interventions, may be fraying at the seams. And there's this whole fascinating new body of research that's saying stepping outside ourselves, whether accidentally, like in a near-death experience, so if someone has trauma, truly nearly dies, heart cessation, drop in brain activity, and they have some profound encounter, or something like flow states experienced via surfing for trauma-induced vets, to MDMA and pharmacological assisted psychotherapy for trauma folks. All the research is consistently showing these days, whether it's at Johns Hopkins or UCLA or Oxford or University of London, all the places that are doing this research are showing moments, even brief moments, outside ourselves, what we're calling ecstasis, which is just from the ancient Greek meaning to stand outside yourself. Those moments have real value. And if we don't know what we're doing with them, if we just kind of bumble towards them, if our attempt at ecstasis is just getting absolutely hammered on a Friday night and driving recklessly and getting in a fight or doing whatever we're doing, like, okay, that's a pretty low grade, under-informed way to go about it. And ultimately, someone who says, chuck it, I'm gonna run away from my life, my marriage, my children, my job, and I'm gonna go off and chase some fantasy in a cave in the Himalayas, or join a cult or do something like that because they're so desperate to get beyond this waking state reality. Neither of those, we would argue, are super productive or particularly well tuned for us these days. But if we actually learn to hack and tune our consciousness more regularly, we can become a lot more skillful. So that brings us back to the ecstasis equation, which is, okay, what is the best way for me to step outside myself and experience a moment or days or weeks or months of what we would call a flow state, where you feel your best, you perform your best, you've lost your selfless, it's timeless, it's effortless, and it's also rich. And those are pretty awesome spots. We've all had them, and the question then is how do we get more of them? So we used one example, which was just the idea of meditation as one tool or technique of ecstasy, and how can we evaluate that against other riskier or more certain options. And Brendan, you just asked, do you feel the flow while going live on Facebook? That's a great question. I mean, once you're beyond the technological hurdles of like which buttons am I pushing and where am I supposed to look and all those kinds of things, the ability to connect with folks in a live setting and have an interesting and inspiring conversation, that I love. That's super fun, super rewarding. I must say, my Achilles heel is in an empty room talking to a camera for like long-term video or recording. That's a whole other skill set. Our buddy Jason Silva, who hosts Brain Games on National Geographic and does all those shots of all, he is a cagey master of that. We were actually hiking in San Francisco for one of those shots of awe, and he's like, oh yeah, we'll just walk, we'll just talk, it'll be totally natural, it'll be exactly just like the conversation we had last night at dinner. I was like, okay, fantastic. And the moment those cameras turned on, he like booted up into some sort of superhuman like presenter guy, and I was completely sandbagged by that. So Facebook Live, hell yes. This is actually our first broadcast, and we're going to be continuing these through the fall and into next year as we get ready for the launch of our book. So it's fun to get to be able to connect to people beyond static posts or only being able to connect to people when we're actually live and in person with them. And Andrew, so we'll do a timeout on the flow equation for anybody that's just joining now. We're going through a really sort of 4-variable equation for you to be able to pick the best ways for you to get into flow at any given point in your life, and also a way to kind of stack rank all of the options that are available to us these days. But before we do that, Andrew just asked, what interrupts flow most for me in everyday life? That's a great question and a fairly easy question because we just got a new puppy, and our puppy has been awake at night. And what I found yesterday, I mean, we only had it for 3 days, and what I found yesterday, in fact, can I see her? She is the newest member of the Flo family, and her name is Chloe. And she is, I was just thinking about this beforehand, she is a master at flow hacker herself. So one of the first things she does, which she has not let us do, is she's got great sleep hygiene, which means that when she's tired, she sleeps, and when she's awake, she's full of it. And she just woke up, and her fullness when she's awake has not let us sleep so much. So I would say, though, the specific answer for me is that I get absolutely hammered if I get a sleep cycle interrupted. And for people that where are you going? And for people that don't know about a little bit of just sleep research and theories, obviously get more if you can. We're not big fans of any of the sleep hacking for trying to trim it down to 4 hours and get more out of it. In fact, Dr. Mike Bruce, who is one of the country's sleep experts, is a friend of ours and a colleague, and he said, I've helped people do those kind of things on the biohacking front, but they're basically suicidal at the end of 6 months, and no one wants to stay on it because they're super lonely. And if anybody has any indications of depression, he says he will not support them doing those sleep cycles. So this little puppy here, literally this little puppy, has wrecked our sleep for the last 2 days. And as a result, I was zero flow yesterday, zero, and I could just feel my brain hadn't fully integrated. And what our friend Mike Bruce, that I was just telling you guys about, was sharing with us, is that we have sleep cycles that are 1.5 hours each. And in each of those 1.5 hour cycles, you go through a bodily kind of flush and cleanse out. You go through a cognitive sort of defrag of your hard drive, and then you go through the cycles of deep sleep, REM, and all the things we normally talk about. So last night I lost 1.5 hours of my sleep cycles, so I didn't get enough, and as a result, I am not as switched on as she is. But yeah, Anthony, you just mentioned, wow, suicidal in 6 months. Yes, and just to qualify that is not every single last person, but it's pronounced enough that he does a psychological wellness survey. And if you've had even mild depression, all right, I'm going to put you down, but I'm going to keep talking about you. How's that? All right. Even someone with mild depression is contraindicated from being allowed to pursue it. So that, I would say, is the simplest and most foundational thing. Not just sleep, but food, hydration, movement, sleep, sunshine. If you get those foundations in place, your odds of getting into a flow state are much, much higher. It's a high energy state. It requires us to be at our best, and in some respects, it allows us to fill up with a maximum amount of energy in our systems, so that our heart is working, pumping, our lungs, oxygenation to the brain, good circulation, good toxin flushing. All that stuff happens when we're in a high vitality state. So in some respects, you could almost just see that flow is nothing more than like if you've ever gone to a county fair and you've seen those strongman mallets, where they whack the bell and it shoots the thing up to the top. Fundamentally, just think of it like a thermometer, and a flow state just occurs when our overall vitality gets to, let's just say, 80%. And fundamentally, we've got leaks, we've got holes in our system, and that's everything from bad relationships to a job we don't like to, being in an urban environment without a lot of exposure to nature, whatever the things are that devitalize us. And then we've got the things that revitalize us. And if you are winning that game, having a peak experience, then you get to it, above 80%, and then suddenly your state of awareness shifts, and you find yourself in an altered state of consciousness, which we would call, just for working purposes, flow, and kind of use that as a really big umbrella. So to tie off the couple of threads we have going right now, we're going to come back to the equation in a second, but I also just Chloe, our little golden retriever puppy. She is an awesome flow hacker because she does a bunch of things. One of the first is sleep hygiene, and that was the little dog leg we just went on. The next is she also entrains to the alphas, so she will always try and follow her big sister or us around and cuddle up next to us. And there's been a lot of research on business leaders, military guys, all that kind of stuff, on that a transformational leader is someone who can entrain not only can they regulate their own nervous system, but they can entrain the people around them, and Tony Robbins, people like that are sort of masters of this sort of thing, of being able to get everybody into a coherent brainwave state, coherent and synchronized heart rates. And our little puppy has been doing that to seek comfort. She's only 7 weeks old, and so when she's been literally letting herself set her clock against others. Another thing she does is seek novelty. She is always exploring and always checking things out, and novelty spikes dopamine. So dopamine is one of the highest pleasure and feel-good chemicals in our brains and bodies. It's one of the things that underpins a flow state. So if you have an option, right, always choose the new thing, always make the new memory. And if you do that, that'll be a little scary, a little edgy, so you might also experience a little shot of cortisol, a little bit of norepinephrine in your system, like, oh boy, I gotta be alert, I gotta be on my game. And you will have more new memories. In fact, Tony Hsieh at Zappos has made a point. He's even built this into his hiring process, where not just like for run-of-the-mill everybody's, but for like someone that they're really like recruiting and going after, headhunting, he will make sure of putting like 7 different short moments. They'll go to a bar for a cocktail, and they'll walk down the street to the restaurant, and they'll go and see some art, and they'll kind of pack together a bunch of new and different events in a single evening or afternoon, so that the experience feels much richer and fuller. So we'll do a quick sidebar on our sidebar, and we'll check in on some of these. Greg just asked, what's the connection between flow and love? And should we look for flow in relationships? Phenomenal question. There's tons of sort of inquiry into that. The short answer is, in fact, and we've actually laid some of this down in a short, a 21-day online tutorial. If anyone's interested, Flow for Couples, you can take a deeper dive into that. That's specifically how do you use the neuroscience of hacking flow to also hack love. So that is possible. I mean, you can sort of reverse engineer the emotion of feeling in love with someone, and not in a, it's not an empty or hollow thing. If you're actually, if all those things are going on for you, you too will feel that. But you can actually, rather than sort of waiting until I feel the emotion just sort of mystically arise in my system, you can go out and you can literally make love. And the ways you do that are increasing oxytocin, increasing dopamine, increasing norepinephrine, increasing all of the serotonin levels in our systems with each other. And then when we do that, the byproduct is, oh, by the way, I feel really connected to you. By the way, I feel a deep sense of trust. By the way, I feel passion or interest. So that there are lots of ways to heighten flow in relationships, and they're all pretty much, all is a strong word, but I would say they're all good in the sense that the couple that experiences more peak states together has a wider range in their relationships. So should we look for flow in relationships? Hell yes. And in fact, if you want, there's even sort of levels of what we would sort of jokingly call gorilla tantra, which is kind of what we talked about, with like using psychosexual practices in a couple's relationship to deepen and intensify the relationship, but also to have a blast. And it can be one of the most ready, accessible, and healthy ways to get into flow with a special someone. And in fact, the old-fashioned name for a flow state derived in romantically is erotocomatose lucidity, which basically means the eroto is the romantic or sexual part. The comatose is basically describing prefrontal cortex shutting down. I'm no longer in my regular sense of self, but the paradox, lucid. So I am clear, but I am not in my normal regular waking state, and that is done. That's been done for centuries. Chris just asked, where can we find more research on transformational states with leaders? So, Chris, if you don't mind following back up and just ask me which leaders, if you can kind of give me a little bit more detail on that. But as it happens. And this is not intended to be talking about our book yet. We're going to wait several months before we really roll out the carpet on that. But that is what we just spent the last 2 years researching and writing. So everyone from Richard Branson, we got to visit him on Necker Island and go kite surfing with him and learn all about how much he builds his life around flow. In fact, if anybody's interested, I wrote an article right when we got back. It's in Forbes. So if you just Google probably Branson and flow, maybe that would get you there. Feel free to check that out. Sergey Brin and Larry Page, we got to spend some time with those guys as well on some of our flow training stuff. Those guys, they're both kite surfers. They both, go to Burning Man. They love to, do skydiving and anything else along those lines. So they are hardcore. flow seekers, and even on the more sort of conventional side, not just like Silicon Valley and billionaire playboys. On the more conventional side, John Hagel, who runs Deloitte's Center for the Edge, has also done a global study and found that the teams, the actual leadership teams and innovation teams that go the furthest and produce the most sort of fundamentally like market cap in their innovations are the ones that are finding passion and flow. And that there is our little puppy dog, Chloe. She is a handful, which was another point about how she is such a great flow hacker, which was she expresses her frustrations and her pain. So when she's upset, we know it. There is no fudging it. But when she's done, she's done. And most of us sit on that kind of stuff and bottle it. So Anthony, you were just asking, hey, good info coming out of the stream. Thanks, really glad you like it. When's the book coming out? It'll be February. We just submitted our manuscript last Friday, so literally a week ago, and we are waiting right now for HarperCollins editor to get back to us, and we're going to be doing a big, huge launch, and that should be a ton of fun. So there's tons of good stories. I mean, it's been so much fun writing that, but I'd rather not wait, so I'd rather just kind of start talking about this stuff now. So fundamentally, let's now wind it back. We talked a little bit about our puppy dog being a good flow hacker. She is. So remember to sleep more, drink enough, right? Seek the novel. Express your feelings, especially pain. That stuff is toxic, held in our systems. Get it out. In fact, I'll tell you a funny story. So we were guiding on Mount Everest on the Tibetan side, and finished, and then got to spend. We put our students back on a plane in Bangkok, and then went to this Railay beach, which is a sort of great limestone climbing beach where you kind of belay from boats, in the beautiful Andaman Sea, and we're climbing up to this jungle. It was like the beach, like that Leonardo DiCaprio movie, if anybody saw that or read the book. It was pretty much one of those islands, and in the middle of the island was this crazy, what's even the right word for it? Lagoon. It was a completely self-contained limestone lagoon in the middle of this almost volcanic jungle, and came across a monkey who was on the side. It was really crazy. It was like slippery ropes and like crazy rocks you had to climb up to get up to the top. And so this couple of German tourists, utterly gripped on the way down. They had clearly no idea what they were getting into. And there was this little monkey out on the side of this rock, and he was completely freaked out. And this is a hell of a Shaggy Dog story, but it's got a good payoff. So he's gripped on the rock, and he doesn't know what to do, and he starts screeching and screeching and screeching because he's like, I'm freaked and I'm about to peel off this thing. And then he finally does this dino lunge, and he goes up and he grabs the rock and he pulls himself off to safety, and then promptly beats off for 30 seconds, nuts on himself, and then runs off into the jungle, like happy as a clam, right? So the point there is other primates, other advanced mammals, relatively speaking, release their stress instantly. And once they've changed their channel, they're back into the present moment. But think about how many times we are stuck in traffic, rehearsing a conversation, or we toss and turn and wake up at 2 a.m. or 3 a.m. and someone, a dickhead boss, or or a friend who hasn't really dealt you right, is rented space in your head, and we're rehearsing those conversations and those kind of things, and we're feeling the physiological stress response, which is really good for avoiding saber-toothed tigers or getting pulling that dino off that rock for that little monkey boy, but not so good when it's sitting in our system day in and day out. So that's another one that our little puppy dog is pretty fantastic at. She's in the moment, she expresses things fully when she's there, and moves on back to what's new and what's next. All right, Andrew just asked, do children tend to find flow more easily than adults, given they're much like puppies? Okay, so great question, and you can kind of have the simple answer would be yes. The longer, slightly geekier and hopefully more interesting answer is they do, and they do it for specific reasons. So one of the mechanisms in altered states, and I'm actually preparing a talk to give next week at Stanford with David Eagleman, who's on our advisory board, but also one of my heroes, Helen Fisher, who gave that great TED talk on why do we cheat, and a bunch of other amazing neuroscientists. So we've really got to I'm starting to bust my ass to try and even step up to that crowd. But one of the things that is really up for grabs in the field of neuroscience, at least as far as we can tell, is theories of selflessness. Why do we, and when and how do we lose our waking consciousness? Right, and so one of the theories that's especially applicable to flow is called transient hypofrontality, which just means our prefrontal cortex powers down, and in those moments we lose our inner critic, we lose a lot of our executive functioning. It's why we can't be kicking ourselves out to past and future scenarios, and we find ourselves in a present moment. It can often feel amazing, relieving, quiet, a whole bunch of things that we don't often get, right? Well, kids basically have developmentally induced transient hypofrontality, which is just a fancy way of saying they haven't stitched their brain together yet, right? Their prefrontal cortex, and so this is why adolescents are so impulsive and all those kind of things, and why most boys are living in their parents' basement until their mid-20s, is that it's not until about 24 that the prefrontal cortex has fully stitched together and is fully, basically riding the horse of the rest of the lower brain impulses. So children, yes, they haven't been acculturated, hopefully they haven't been too traumatized and aren't carrying too much of the weight of the world on their shoulders. And there's some of that hardware just isn't hooked up yet. So children have, again, what is called developmentally induced transient hypofrontality, and have lots of thoughts and interest on that, because we built a Montessori school, actually a sort of a flow-based Montessori school for our kids when they were really little, and have spent lots of time advising schools. And Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, the original researcher on flow states, went looking in the world for organizations like, okay, this is how it happens, who's doing it right at an organizational level, and one of the only folks he found was Montessori schools. So if anybody's interested, Montessori schools, Waldorf schools, any of them that allow for deep concentration, uninterrupted work cycles, and a lot of fine motor and gross motor integration into learning. So I'm stitching, I'm weaving, I'm playing, I'm sweeping, I'm doing things with my body and brain together for extended periods, not just arbitrary 45-minute or 60-minute blocks of time. Those are all great places to find kids in flow in action. All right. So wow, this was one hell of a dog leg. But coming on back to the notion of the flow or ecstasis equation, because for anybody that's just joining, I'm Jamie from Flow Genome Project, and we are here to talk about exactly that, to say what are the best ways for me to alter my states of consciousness in, hopefully, and this is our editorial, but hopefully in service of a richer, better, fuller life, right? Not just kind of being a bliss junkie and just using it to zone out or get or escape. So I'm going to take a moment, go through that with everybody, and then come back to the comments feed, and we can kind of keep going from there. So if for those that were on earlier, we talked about the equation being value, how worthwhile is this to me, equaling the time it takes to get good enough at it to produce it, and the time any given episode requires, times the reward, right? What do I get out of it? Am I kinder? Am I more inspired? Am I more energized? Am I healthier? Right? Am I more innovative and creative? Whatever those are, whatever those criteria are for you, all divided by the risk. Okay, so Anthony, you just asked, hey, have you studied the effects of drugs on flow states, right? Energy drinks, Adderall, weed, mushrooms, interest, those kinds of things. Okay, yes. Short answer, yes. And in fact, we use the example of meditation as one edge or one boundary case. It's fundamentally safe, it's incremental, its benefits are whatever you earn, like whatever you find you've earned, right? But it could take a hell of a long time, right? So the risk is fairly low. The time is quite extended, and the reward is going to depend. It's going to depend on your teacher, your tradition. It's going to depend on you. It's going to depend on dumb luck. It's going to depend on genetic disposition. It'll depend on 1,000 things. But Oliver Sacks, right, the famous NYU neuroscientist, said that's the thing about drugs, right? The thing about drugs is you take the pill, you pop the pill, you take the hit, boom. You are undeniably someplace else, and there's an efficacy to that, meaning you've massively shrunk the time equation. So if, and you sort of plug in, let's go beyond mushrooms and take a super extreme example. If anybody saw The Simpsons, where Homer, I don't remember whether it's the one where he goes to Burning Man or whether he's just in the desert, but he licks the toad, right? So the venom or actually this coating of that toad skin is 5-MeO-DMT. It's arguably the most potent psychedelic on the planet. And in 15 minutes flat, you will, as reports state, get catapulted out to the back of the white light universe and come home again. So run that one through the ecstasis equation. The value, right, equals time. Okay, time compared to 10 or 20 years of meditation, you got 15 minutes of gobsmacked otherworldliness, right? 15 minutes, no skill, no nothing required. So time off the charts. Reward, okay, you may see infinity. And then some. How much of it can you bring back? Open question, right? Divided by the risk. Now, this is industrial strength brain detergent, so you would really need to check and assess for yourself life and limb safety. Do I have physiologically, it's not particularly a dangerous compound, but psychologically, ontologically, right? What do I believe, and how do I understand how the way the world works? There are some baked-in risks, and there are people, especially when confronted with just, psychedelic bitch slaps like that, can come unglued and not always make it back, or like it's like that old line in Apocalypse Now, right, where the guy who first went upriver to try and knock out Marlon Brando's Kurtz, he goes native as well, and he writes this note. It's like, sell the house, sell the wife, sell the kids. I'm not coming back. I'm never coming back. And with ayahuasca tourism, with all those kinds of things, you've got folks that are they're jumping into the deeper end of the pool before they've even learned to swim. And so those factors, value equals time times reward divided by risk, give us kind of a floating scale. Kristen Ulmer, who is a friend of our project, she's also pretty much the world's most famous and accomplished woman extreme skier. For years, she literally got her rocks off, risking her life. And there was a series of challenges that she experienced in Chamonix, where she nearly died 5 times in a season. And then, funnily enough and luckily enough for her, she got invited to go to Burning Man, and this was probably 15 years ago, and she realized, oh my God, I feel exactly the same way at 2 a.m. out there in that wild-ass desert with the crazy carnival going on and all the amazing art and all the sort of music and serendipity and sort of performance theater. She's like, I get the same feeling at Burning Man that I do on a 70-degree face, risking my ass. So when she plugged in her life to that value equation, to that ecstasis equation, she's like, okay, the value I'm getting is off the charts. Skiing, base jumping, doing all these kind of things. But risk, it's almost binary, right? It's everything or it's nothing. Curtains, right? Game over. And so when she found another outlet, wild-ass crazy music and arts festival, she got super into like building crazy art cars. She's built some of the most famous art cars on the playa, even one that one of the Google guys just bought, the Scorpion. She's thrown herself into a totally different expression of stepping outside her waking consciousness. And she said, she still skis, she still runs training camps. She's now combined that though with Zen meditation, so another one of the kind of middling band experiences. And interestingly, it's the tagline of this particular tradition is sort of enlightenment, a taste of enlightenment in 30 minutes, which is, it's a tagline, but it does give you a direct state experience of like, oh, this is what it's like to step outside my regular story, even if it's just for a little bit. So as an example, Kristen Ulmer, the extreme skier that we've just been describing, she realized, the risk variable when I was running my equation as an extreme and adventure athlete became unacceptable to me. And and now I can invest my time in other ways that are safer and therefore fit my stage of life, fit my I'd like to stay here, kind of will to persist, and I can tweak and tune some of the others. So she invested a bit more time, for instance, in building an art car or traveling out to the desert or becoming a part of that Burning Man community. But in doing so, she has rejiggered her equations in ways that are sustainable and valuable to her. All right, so Carlos, let's see, how do you see ego fitting in the relationship to flow? I work a lot on how the ego, not egotistical, but how the ego, I'm presuming you're talking about kind of like the psychological construct of our self-identity, forms the fabric of the mind based on core programs developed in younger life. Okay, let's see, and I have to hit see more to see more. We can discover states of consciousness by reprogramming core programs away from the ego fabric, writing about it now. Yeah, absolutely. And by the way, you spelled programs with an double M-E-S. I'm assuming you're a Commonwealth there. So right on that one. As far as the role of ego and flow, fundamentally, that's the one place we tend not to experience it. Right, so and that's the shutting down of the prefrontal cortex, or in other states, psychedelic states, mystical states, it can also be overwhelmed. So it's either closed down and not activated, or hyperactivated and hyperconnected. And if it's that, it sort of serves the same function. And that, by the way, that's my great white whale right now. We tried to track it down for our book, and like literally a unified theory of selflessness based on all the research that's going on at Yale and in London, at Oxford, and Harvard and UCLA. couldn't. I mean, the first thing, and that's actually what I'll be talking about at Stanford next week. I'm just going to come. I'm not going to do the normal TED thing, like with a grand ta-da, like, and here's how we save the world in 20 minutes. I'm just going to be like, look, here's the most clear-headed explanation of my question, and hopefully there's enough smart people in this room we can figure it out in the next couple of days. But the relationship of selflessness to flow is, regardless of the mechanism, either hypoactivity, not a lot of it, or hyperactivity, too much of it. It knocks the ego out. And what that lets us do, and this is really kind of cool, is we no longer have to be stuck in our psychology. We no longer have to live from behind our eyes in our stories, right? In our biography. I'm Jamie, and I was born, and this is where I hurt, and this is where I'm awesome, and this is what I'd like you to do is validate my stories for me. And when I feel sad, the first thing I do is I look around to what's the most credible narrative I can use to justify and validate my emotional physiological experience. If anybody's interested in checking this, Dan Gilbert, a psychologist at Harvard, wrote a kick-ass book called Stumbling on Happiness. And it is funny, he's a great writer, but it just basically describes our future selves. Our present selves are just always making bets with our future self that's never ever happy. And he really does a great job kind of breaking down and deconstructing how we play this game of self-awareness. And in a flow state, you can get beyond that monkey mind. And you can do it just by tuning your neurophysiology. And as a result, so the idea, just using a simple example, what's her bucket? Amy Cuddy, that Harvard, again, another Harvard psychologist, but she gave, I think, what is now the second most popular TED Talk of all time, and it was all about the Wonder Woman pose, stand with the, your elbows on your hips and your feet really wide apart, and it's going to do amazing things for you. And a lot of people afterwards were like, bullshit, they tried to rerun the studies, and there's a lot of mud in the water there on just how dumbed down you can make embodied cognition, meaning my body and my brain affect each other, my body affects my thinking. But nonetheless, she's held her ground, I think, somewhat credibly, and the general premise of her whole talk and her subsequent book is we can shift our neurophysiology ahead of our psychology or story about something. And she's done all kinds of studies, everything from the eye hunch. So if anybody's got teenage daughters, they did crazy studies on basically phone-based postures. So the eye hunch being, that sort of cooped over, head down, shoulder hunched position, and it gets worse the smaller the screen is. So it's less for a laptop. It's iPads are middling and iPhones are the worst. And basically found that teenage girls, otherwise regular, healthy, stable teenage girls, are experiencing excessive submissiveness, excessive depression, and anxiety. And they're fundamentally, literally, they're holding themselves in the postures of submissiveness, anxiety, right? And lack of confidence. So they're literally depressing themselves by how they're holding themselves in their body. Now, turn that around back to Amy Cuddy and the Wonder Woman pose, you can do the opposite as well. So that's what, again, Tony Robbins bouncing up and down on his trampoline and beating himself up. There's a kind of goofy baby boomer versions of it. But yes, is the short answer. So once you realize that, you just continue to conduct that thought experiment. Be like, okay, if I don't actually have to live in my stories, which are really just made up slightly after the fact, like we sense and perceive things first, and then we make up the story, or we attach a pre-existing narrative to the sensations we feel, and that feels like equilibrium. That feels like my insides match my outsides, and it's usually someone else's fault, right? Most of our storytelling is either seeking, it's seeking pleasure, avoiding pain. It's as simple as that. We just gin up a bunch of complicated stuff around it. And if anybody's looking for a non-technical, just give me enough to be dangerous, those 4 agreements from what's his bucket are, that's not very helpful, I understand, but 4 agreements, you can Google it. It's basically just like, I think it's like, don't make assumptions, be impeccable with your word, everyone's doing their best. It's just basically 4 that just make good, solid sense as virus scans on just getting out of our own heads. Once we do that, though, once we realize, the question is how? How do I? That sounds neat. I'd love to. Let's try. So the simplest is breathing, movement, hydration, sleep, and then you can, and then repeat, and then go back to breathing, and you can just with those tools, like Dave Asprey is a friend of ours and runs Bulletproof Executive and all that kind of stuff. And he's got no shortage of things for you to buy to get you there. Everything from coffee and the right, various stuff to put in it, all the way to some of the neurohacking. And you can geek out on that, and you can go to get nootropic stacks and supplements. You can really, you can take that to an extreme. Or you can just be like, hey, I'm here, I'm alive, the sun shines every day, I need water, it's good to move, I'm a bipedal primate, and breath, and breath. In fact, we are, and do not worry, I'm going to come back and tie this fucker off with the whole ego question, but even as a sign of how central the notion of breathing is as a performance tool, as a consciousness mod, if you will. We were just with Laird Hamilton, the big wave surfer, last week, and we were learning his breathing protocols, and he's been learning and training with Wim Hof. So there's lots of people who've been doing Wim's respiratory trainings, but he's also been continuing to modify it. We're going back next week and sharing with him some of ours, which are combinations of free breath diving, some of the Navy SEALs protocols, as well as Stan Grof's holotropic breathing, and then some additional inventions of our own, which you have to be live with us to actually get to do. And I don't mean this kind of live, I mean actually warm bodies in person. But the point being is that awareness of breath and the power of it to control physiology first, and then psychology, and then performance, has moved from pranayama, the kind of notions of Hindu and Vedic and yogic techniques and practices, fully into Western worlds. And that has allowed people to start playing with it. So, for instance, Laird will go out in a big wave lineup like Peahi or Jaws out of Maui, and he will be doing his breath prep in the water right before dropping onto a giant wave. The SEALs, before they go into the kill house in their training zones, will do a version of hypoxic training to basically pre-wire their system to be able to, okay, next time I get to this, it's familiar. I know my limits aren't where my brain and body are first telling me they are, and I can recover from peak exertion, peak stresses faster. Okay, so this was a roundabout thread to come back to. There's a ton of stuff you can do to geek out on shifting your states of consciousness via your neurobiology, and you don't have to spend a dime. We are human beings, and we can breathe more, move more, drink more, get more sunshine. And if you want greater intensity, you can breathe more, and you can breathe more rapidly, you can breathe more deeply, you can breathe a host of different patterns which fundamentally tweak your states in different ways because of the nitrogen, the oxygen, and the carbon dioxide in our gaseous mix of the air we breathe. And fundamentally, it starts out at 80% nitrogen and, more or less 20% oxygen with a tiny bit of carbon dioxide. You blow that out, your number, the nitrogen stays the same, the carbon dioxide increases, right? But you start playing with your nitrogen mix via breathing, you start playing with your carbon dioxide amounts, and you start playing with your oxygen, you can radically shift your consciousness. As far as, right, Stan Grof, who was at Johns Hopkins, who was one of the first I believe he was Czech originally, definitely Eastern European, came to Hopkins in the early 60s, did some of the pioneering LSD research, and then when that was removed from research accessible chemicals in, I think, 63 or 64, he then developed holotropic breathing, which was like, I still want to study these phenomenons of consciousness, and how do I do it? And so he used hyperventilating breathing, which is fundamentally just breathe really deeply, really fast for a long ass time, several hours, with music, lying down, etc. I mean, that's pretty damn low tech compared to any of the old school traditions. You would always have, you got to do this with your nostril and this with the palate of your tongue and this mantra and this visualization. And it was basically just breathe really fast, really deep, really long, see what happens. And he documented that over 20 years or plus and found almost no differentiation between pharmacologically psychedelic states and experiences that he'd been studying in the early 60s compared to these ones, the ones that were actually just done just by breathing alone. So let's roll this all back, get back to the notion of what do we do with ego and what's its role in flow states. And fundamentally, its role can be retraining it just like our little puppy. You don't need to try and kill the ego. You don't need to transcend the ego. I mean, you can if you want, go for it. But I mean, you can look at the entire baby boomer hippie generation. They really just tried to, went after that one in spades, and it didn't turn out super well. You could make a case. It's largely because the notion of killing, banishing, transcending, suppressing the bad ego, originated in a different time, different place. Fundamentally, Asian non-dual traditions. When it got imported into the 60s and 70s in the States, hell's bells, man. A lot of people tried, a lot of people failed. And if you ask me, I've never seen more of an uptight bunch than West Coast Buddhists. So clearly, you know, the notion is got problems. So what we would propose instead is don't try and kill the ego, retrain it, and retrain it to basically serve as the dashboard or monitor of your self-system. So rather than engaging my stories, rather than getting stuck there, you can notice them. You can be like, oh, I feel pissed off right now, or I'm really tired and cranky, or I'm elated and, you know, whatever it is. Notice it. That's awesome. Just don't get sucked down into that reality tunnel exclusively. So stay up on the balcony. Ron Heifetz at Harvard Business School talks specifically about that. Like the move is to stay on the balcony of your experience. And once you're up there, then you realize, I got a bunch of other interventions. I could yell at my wife or my husband or call up my friend and bitch about my boss. Like I could go into my story to try and get energy, right? The seeking the pleasure, the avoiding pain, having people affirm the way I see the world. Or I could stay on the balcony and I could be like, I need 30 minutes of cardio. I need a pint of orange juice with high vitamin C. I need an hour of direct sunlight to boost my vitamin D levels. And I need, you know, an orgasm, a beer, and an inspiring book. Awesome. And then go do those things. And when we do it that way, at first it feels almost, it's crazy counterintuitive. Because it reminds me of like being when we were little kids, and I don't know if you guys ever did this, it was too fucking hot outside to do anything, and you'd be playing Monopoly, but you'd get into these crazy ass games, and it would be like 3 days, and you would run out of all the money, and you're writing each other little IOUs on the, you know, scraps of paper. Well, to stop playing our psychological games and to kick ourselves up onto the dashboard, right, the balcony of our selves, of our self-systems, and to just realize, oh, I can just tune these different things instead of getting sucked in. It's almost like tearing up all your IOUs on that Monopoly game. Because I've got all these stories where people owe me shit. There's stories where I feel that my parents didn't love me enough. There's stories where I feel my brother or my sister, shafted me at that family funeral. There's stories where my boss just doesn't get what a genius I am. There's stories. And we're actually surprisingly loath to give up on them because they've got those little scribbled bits of paper, I owe you, juice, energy, affirmation, righteousness, indignation, whatever it's going to be. And so making that move it's dead simple. It's dead simple. This is the craziest thing, is that these days, and I'm not sure, I mean, this is where having conversations with folks like you guys is so fun, because this is just what we've been heads down researching for the last couple of years. We're just now coming up for air, and want to see if it lands for folks. Because what it really feels like is there's an opportunity these days because of how far and progressed psychology has been, neurobiology, right? We're being able to see what's happening in the brain and the mind at the same time, never before, right? Technology, we can do all these awesome things and put ourselves into states, and pharmacology, right? We can tune and hack things on demand. The intersection of those four forces have come together to be like, oh, here is the skeleton key, right? Here's the skeleton key for next level culture. And what we're trying to do is just say, hey, here's an open source operating system to go and have a ton of fun in that culture. And it's open source in the sense of all we're trying to lay out is here's some basics, here's a backbone to this thing. You go try it, your mileage will vary, you'll come up with awesome